Toto. I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. This time around, we pay respects to an octogenarian, the most watched movie in history, in fact, according to the Library of Congress. It's the one and only The Wizard of Oz, originally released in 1939, and this year celebrating an 80th anniversary. Our special birthday party guest is perfect for this episode. It's John Fricke, the world's top Oz historian and author of several books on Judy Garland and The Wizard of Oz. You might not remember John's name, but chances are you've seen his face or heard his voice featured on the DVD commentary and making of bonus features found on The Wizard of Oz DVD and Blu-ray. This is the guy to talk about all things Oz, so this should be a real treat. John and I will take a trip down the yellow brick road and examine why this film is worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it stood the test of time, and more. But before I pull back the curtain on my interview with John, I thought I'd share some key details about The Wizard of Oz, culled from Wikipedia, to get you up to speed. The Wizard of Oz is a 1939 American musical fantasy film produced by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Widely regarded to be one of the greatest films in cinema history, it's the most commercially successful adaptation of L. Frank Baum's 1900 children's fantasy novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Directed primarily by Victor Fleming, who left the production to take over the troubled Gone with the Wind, the film stars Judy Garland as Dorothy Gale alongside Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, and Burt Lahr. Noel Langley, Florence Ryerson, and Edgar Allan Wolfe received credit for the screenplay, but others made uncredited contributions. The songs were written by Edgar Yip Harburg, who did the lyrics, and Harold Arlen, who handled the music. The musical score and the incidental music were composed by Herbert Stothard. Characterized by its use of Technicolor, although not being the first film to use it, fantasy storytelling, musical score, and memorable characters, The Wizard of Oz has become an American pop culture icon. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, but lost to Gone with the Wind, also directed by Victor Fleming. Now, it did win in 2 other categories. That's Best Original Song for, of course, Over the Rainbow, and Best Original Score by Herbert Stothard. While this film was considered a critical success upon its release back on August 25, 1939, and it was MGM's most expensive production at that time, it failed to make a profit for MGM until the 1949 re-release of the movie. The Wizard of Oz was long ago named to the National Film Registry and has been deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress. Today, the film commands a 98% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score clocks in at 9.41 out of 10. Let's journey way back and give a listen to the movie's trailer.
Many, many miles east of nowhere lies the amazing land of Oz, a magnificent empire created in the mind of a man who wrote a great book about it. Like wildfire in the wheat field, the fabulous tale of the Wizard of Oz spread from town to city to nation to the entire world. Although the Wizard of Oz has captivated the children of 4 generations and fired the imaginations of those youthful adults who have never grown old, although 10 million copies of the book have reached eager hands and eager hearts, no one has dared the towering task of giving life and reality to the land of Oz and its people. Every delightful character of L. Frank Baum's classic is now reborn. Every glorious adventure has been recaptured and painted with a rainbow. The celebration in Munchkinland, the flying monkeys, the rescue of Dorothy, the castle of the witch, the Palace of Oz, and Dorothy's strange journey to the Emerald City to find the wonderful Wizard of Oz himself.
We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. We hear he is a wizard of whiz, if ever a whiz there was. If ever, oh, ever a whiz there was, the Wizard of Oz is one because of the wonderful things he does. We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Now, if you're still an Oz virgin, I guess I have to warn you that spoilers are ahead. But really, seriously, if you don't already know this story and the characters, if you haven't seen the picture, what's wrong with you? Put this podcast on hold and go finally watch The Wizard of Oz. All right, is everybody back to Kansas? It's time to introduce the planet's preeminent Oz expert, John Fricke. So welcome, John, to Cineversary.
Thank you, Eric. I think it's an honor and a privilege to do something like this. I have been an Oz fan literally all my life, and the fact that I have been able to spend so many years now researching and sharing and exulting and commenting, it's like a dream that I never really dared to dream would come true. It certainly isn't something I set out to do, but I'm very happy to be asked.
Fantastic. I'm thrilled that you did say yes, and thank you again. So let's get into this here. 80 years of The Wizard of Oz. It's really hard to believe. It feels like such a timeless movie. We'll talk about aspects of that. But it has been 8 decades, and that says something. So first, when and where did you see this film the first time, John, and why is this movie so important to you?
Well, I saw it the first time when I was 5, and I might have seen it before that, except that it was on television the first time I was 5, 1956. And
that
I was
the
a kid.
First year it came to broadcast television, correct?
Yes, November 3rd, 1956 on CBS. Henry Ford was a huge Judy fan, and he had started a monthly series of specials with CBS about 10 months before. The series led off with Judy Garland's performing TV debut. And after 12 months, 14 months, he decided, okay, that's enough. I'll invest Ford ads somewhere else on TV. And to conclude the Ford Star Jubilee, which is what the show was called, they decided they would show a big blockbuster movie. And MGM wouldn't give them Gone with the Wind in 1956, but they said, what about Wizard of Oz? Henry Ford was happy because it was Judy. Her special earlier on in the series had blown everything else out of the water in terms of ratings. And up to that point in my own development, I loved music, and I loved musical films and musical cartoons, so I was steeped in whatever Disney I could see by November 1956. But I was watching with cousins and uncles and my dad in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, for any local people who might be listening. We just sat to watch this movie. And my dad loved music. We had that great bond in common, and movies. And I can vividly picture myself sitting on the floor of my cousin's family living room, watching it on a black and white set. I crawled up into my dad's lap when Margaret Hamilton sent the Winged Monkeys after Dorothy and Company. But the rest of the time, I was right on the floor. And I think you can probably tell even from this much that I am very enthusiastic about things that I love. And I talked of nothing else but that film for the next day after day after day.
Amazing.
And luckily my birthday was coming up, my 6th birthday, and my parents bought me a Wizard of Oz storybook and the Wizard of Oz soundtrack vinyl album and a Judy Garland vinyl album that she'd recorded in 1956. So that launched it all.
Great recollection, and you have a crystal clear memory, so kudos to you for that. Of course, this is that kind of movie that would have made such a strong impression on you and other children, especially back in the day when you didn't have, on demand. You didn't have DVD or VHS for that matter. You had to wait. It was an event when a major movie came to broadcast television on the handful of channels you were able to get, right? So
right,
this,
yeah, there were
would
the
have
three
been
networks.
3 networks, absolutely.
And
right.
that was it. And again, it in the next 3 years, because CBS didn't show Wizard of Oz again until 1959, across those 3 years, I found out that there was a series of 39 Oz books that had many, many, many more adventures. I found out that Judy Garland had made other movies and other records. Mm-hmm. And so by the time December 1959 came around, I was so primed to see Wizard of Oz again for only the second time. And it was as extraordinary, it was more extraordinary because I was more aware at age 9 than I would have been at age 5.
Sure.
And much more of a fan. And it just snowballed from there. My parents were extraordinarily supportive. I got the Oz books. I got the Garland albums. They would put me to bed when I was a little boy at 7:38. But if there was a Judy Garland movie on the late movie in Milwaukee, they would set an alarm for my room for 10:30 and let me get up. Because their attitude was, what harm can possibly come to anybody from watching Meet Me in St. Louis or Easter Parade or Judy and Mickey Rooney putting on a show in the barn, you know? It was a great pop culture learning experience. Remember I said that The Wizard of Oz wasn't shown for 3 years after the first telecast?
Yes.
Between 56 and 59.
Mm-hmm.
On a December night in 1959, my kid brother and I were watching the CBS Sunday night lineup, which was Lassie, Dennis the Menace, Ed Sullivan. And at the end of Lassie, my parents are down the hall doing the dinner dishes. They were not hearing the TV. And as the Lassie crawl was finishing up of credits, the voiceover said, be sure to be with us 2 weeks from tonight for another adventure of Lassie. Next week at this time, and it cut to a portrait of Judy holding Toto. And the announcer said, next week at this time, CBS proudly presents Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz. Well, I let out a yelp and ran down the hall, just so excited and telling my parents. And they hadn't heard this, and they were very afraid, not Johnny, because they didn't want me to be disappointed. And I said, no, I heard it. I really heard it. Next week. And then I went back to wait for more commercials to see. I couldn't care less about Dennis the Menace that night. But the next commercial was just his sponsor. So I walked back to the kitchen. And just as I was about to turn the corner from the hallway to go into the kitchen, my parents had evidently been talking about this since I had first come running to them. And to this day, I can't remember if I heard my mom say it to my dad or my dad say it to my mom, but one of them said to the other, did you see the way his eyes were shining? Now, that's the kind of parents I had. And that's the kind of joy I see when I go to the festivals, when I do lectures, when I introduce the film. There are always people there of all ages who have that excitement and that joy.
Absolutely. For my part, I can't recall when I first watched this film. So I was born in 68, but it was certainly on broadcast television in the 70s. So that's when I first caught it, of course. And I was probably around 6 or so. And I don't know if I necessarily copped to it the first time, but it was subsequent viewings, I'm sure that, wow, this is just a fun, great movie. And just, it spurred the interest in fantasy and myth and things like that. And of course, Star Wars came along a few years later and became like my Beatles on the Ed Sullivan moment and for my generation and so forth. But The Wizard of Oz, you could just tell the influences it had on movies like that and others. And as I've gotten older, I just appreciate this movie more and more. And I never, ever find it old or boring or I've seen it so many times, I'm sick of it. I just watched it again the other day just to pop in the Blu-ray to kind of check out, like I said, the bonus features. It went on autoplay, so it just started playing the movie by itself. And I had not, intended to sit down and watch this from beginning to end, but I found myself, an hour and a half in, I'm watching the whole movie. What am I doing? I didn't even plan this, and it was just so entertaining. And I remember when the movie was over, I looking at my wife and just like, wow, it resonates. It's amazing. So, yeah, it's an important movie to me too, as it is to so many Americans and people across the world. But let's go a little deeper here, John. Why is The Wizard of Oz, the film, why is it worth celebrating 80 years later? How has it stood the test of time, and why does it still matter?
Well, I think you can look at it historically from the point of view that it came along 80 years ago at a time when all the coalescence of the studio system, the great era of the studio system, was coming together. It was one of the very first Technicolor feature films. It was one of the first 7 or 8. And sound had only come into really good practice in the preceding decade. Music had become important because of sound. MGM was, as one of the MGM workers said back in the 70s when he was interviewed about Wizard of Oz, he said, many people worked for many studios. They made good movies. We worked for MGM. We made better ones. It was the Tiffany of Hollywood, and that's not an original statement. But everything had come of age technologically, and with the kind of performers who were needed to really kick across a movie musical fantasy, as it were. And I think it has lasted because, as you found out, it still communicates. It still cuts across every kind of changing taste in entertainment and music, because it is the best of what it was. The very best people in front of the camera, behind the camera, worked on that film. They did that a lot, and there are some films that have lasted and many that have not, but Wizard of Oz was just the bomb story, MGM's determination to do it properly and to spend, first it was $1.5 million, then it was $2 million, then it was $2.5 million, eventually coming in at $3.7 million,
and that's a lot of money for 1938.
You bet
right?
It was. For $3.7 million, you could make 3 major movies and probably about 20 Andy Hardys or Maisie or Dr. Kildare's. Plus, I always like to throw this in because I think it's very important. You had that film built around somebody who was not only proven to be the greatest entertainer of recorded time, but somebody whose communicative power was more than just dazzling you with a song or footwork or humor or drama. She reached out and pulled you into that story from frame one, much as we always say that Frank Baum's Oz books are like fifth dimensional, because you do not read chapter 1, page 1. You go through the page. You go on the adventure.
I can testify because I did dig into this series after, I reached a certain age. I wanted to explore the whole kind of realm of Oz and all the characters. And so I didn't read every one of his books, but quite a few of them. And they're all equally really entertaining and satisfying.
Well, you just used the other word. I used communicate and cut across and timeless, as you said too, but entertain. It entertains in a way that very few films in this era or in recent eras have done. They have forgotten how to make movies like that. There was such hue and cry, 3 years ago, about La La Land? Oh, a musical. Well, it was very well done, but it was not integral to those performers. It was not integral to those filmmakers. They had admired musicals, they echoed musicals, but it wasn't second nature to them to make a film like that. Whereas everybody who was making The Wizard of Oz, that was as natural as breathing to them. To do that kind of vaudeville shtick, that kind of direct communication with an audience, it launched Arthur Freed, the MGM songwriter, as a producer. He was the unbilled associate on Oz, and Mervyn LeRoy, the billed producer, certainly contributed major things, but it was Arthur who stepped away from Wizard of Oz, went right into Babes in Arms, and created the Arthur Freed musical unit at MGM, which for the next 20 years made the timeless movie musicals that, as I said, they don't know how to make anymore.
Yeah, it's a good point. And he's largely uncredited on this film, so...
You'll never find his name on the screen. We always reference him because, again, he was the one who went to Louis B. Mayer in fall of 1937. Broadway Melody of 1938 was just going into the theaters, and Freed and his partner, Nacio Brown, had written the original songs for that. But original songs be damned, the thing that was making the biggest hit in that movie was 15-year-old Judy Garland singing Dear Mr. Gable, You Made Me Love You.
That's right.
And Freed said, boss, I've been writing songs for Metro, and for those who are listening, I know you've got a very educated following, but Arthur Freed is the man who across the late 20s and through the 30s wrote the lyrics to Singing in the Rain, You Are My Lucky Star, All I Do Is Dream of You. Virtually all the songs in the movie Singing in the Rain from 1951 are Arthur Freed songs.
Yes.
But he wanted to produce, and he went to Mayer and said, may I find a property? Mayer said yes. And Freed was smart enough to know that he'd have to build the property around somebody who was going to be available, who wasn't going to be Jeanette MacDonald or Eleanor Powell working in a grade A picture for somebody else. Arthur said later, he quoted said, "I made my bet on Judy, and she helped me as much as I helped her."
Yeah, absolutely. Well put. So how else has this movie stood the test of time, and why does it still matter, do you think? There's so many things we could talk about, but what would you put your finger on?
Oz matters because they're not aware of what it takes to do that kind of movie again. Nor would they have the money to. One of the reasons it came in at $3.7 million as opposed to $107 million is that everybody at MGM was work for hire.
That's right.
They had all the technicians to make those things happen, and the songwriters who were getting X $100 a week, and the actors who were getting, from the Munchkins, maybe if they were lucky, $5 to $50 take-home pay plus room and board and transportation, up to Toto's trainer who was getting $125 or $150.
Wow.
The next lowest was Judy, who got between $400 and $500 a week, depending on which part of Oz we're talking about in terms of her studio contract. Judy made $9,600 and change for making The Wizard of Oz.
Unbelievable.
Period.
So it's the efficiency of the studio system here. If they were to, budget this out as an independent production where you're hiring people and talents and so forth, at the time, what do you think it would have clocked in at?
I don't know. It's impossible to guesstimate that. And because Buddy Gillespie, the genius of special effects at Metro, he had to go in and say, I need $10,000 to start the tornado. And they'd say, why? And he said, I don't know, because I don't know how I'm going to do the tornado, but I've got to have money to start with.
Sure.
And they gave it to him. I have said this in other interviews, but it's worth underscoring again. MGM was the biggest playground for adults that has ever existed. They brought in everybody who was the best at what they did, got out of the way and let them do it, and encouraged them to do it. Just in the case of the tornado alone, they tried a smoke funnel, a rubber funnel, a water funnel, until they came up with chicken wire wrapped with muslin. One of my favorite present-day Oz anecdotes about, maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the Weather Channel did a special called The 100 Greatest Moments in Weather History or something like that. And number 52 or 53 was the tornado in The Wizard of Oz.
Incredible.
Because it spurred so many young men and young women to go into meteorology.
No question. Yeah, that's a great point.
If you compare it to tornadoes in other movies, CGI, fine, they do a nice job, they do a good job, but the tornado in Wizard of Oz, again, another point, and this is all stuff that has come to me as the years of further research and looking into every nook and cranny, because I care about it for me, and then I'm lucky to find ways to share it. In 1938-39, the only existing footage of a tornado was a scratchy, blurry, 22-second film of a water spout off, I think, Cuba. That was it. They had to build on what they had heard and the pictures they had seen.
Yeah.
And yet they created something that is devastating to this day. If I hadn't gone into journalism or performing, both of which I have done over the years, I would have been a meteorologist. No question.
Because of The Wizard of Oz?
Because of The Wizard of Oz, yes.
Amazing. It just says all you need to know about the power and impact of this movie and the influence and inspiration it's had on so many people.
Well, and the number of people who have gone into the performing arts, who have gone into costume design or scenic design or special effects or performing. How many kids have put on The Wizard of Oz in their basement or their backyard? And this one wants to play that part. And 30 years ago, for the 50th anniversary, which is when I did the first, the Green Book, the pictorial history for Turner at that point. And it was a huge success. In the process of doing that book, I worked with MGM Home Video on the 50th anniversary VHS, the supplemental 15 minutes at the end. I wrote a 35-page booklet that was attached to the cover of the box. So between MGM and Warner Publishing, I was on the Today Show and CNN and Entertainment Tonight, and it just really snowballed. And I got sent all over. And I got sent for the first time to some of the national Wizard of Oz festivals. There were 3 at that point. And these were festivals in Frank Baum's hometown, Judy Garland's hometown, and a small town in Indiana. And because it was the 50th anniversary, they were really blown up big. And there were parades and floats and the surviving Munchkins. And I remember thinking, at the height of all this, it can't sustain itself. It cannot go on like this. Because, again, hundreds, literally hundreds of kids on the parade routes dressed in blue and white check gingham and red slippers, or in monkey costumes, or in Scarecrow, Tin Man, Lion costumes. And now I've been doing those festivals ever since. They continue. And when I ride in the parade, doing my, Prince Philip wave, as it's called, to all the people, there are the same kids. Well, not the same kids, but the kids in the same costumes, who are now probably the kids of the kids I saw 30 years ago.
Amazing.
It's honest.
Yeah.
And I think I wouldn't stress it, and I wouldn't exult over it if I didn't see it and believe it myself.
Sure. For my take and answer to this question, why does it still matter? How has it stood the test of time? I mean, I can't improve much on what you said, but here are my thoughts. To me, anyway, it's arguably the greatest Hollywood musical of all time. I know Singin' in the Rain is often ranked as the best, and it's one of my favorites too. But I believe this is an even better film, and it has the most memorable and beloved songs in a Hollywood musical, period. Most of us know these tunes and lyrics by heart, and they, like the film, have become part of cherished Americana. And the color on display in this film, you talked about the Technicolor, the 3-strip Technicolor, which was a new process at the time. It's just glorious, and the amount of which they've done restoration work on this for all the subsequent home video editions and everything, it's still so vivid and chromatic and beautiful. To me, this, even more than Gone with the Wind in the same year, has the most breathtakingly beautiful color palette. And thanks to that Technicolor process. In the way the film miraculously transitions to a fantastical chromatic world when Dorothy steps out of her sepia-toned home and into the Munchkinland world there, it's just unforgettable. It's instantly transporting. It takes us into a realm of cinematic magic, and I can only imagine how 1939 audiences must have been awe-inspired by that segue.
I've done 4 books on Oz and 3 on Judy, and when I've gone around the country to meet people and sign and that sort of thing, the older people will come. I'm one of the older people now myself, but I mean the older people I've met, older than I, who were in the theaters in 1939. I will never forget one lady, little old lady, very tiny. You couldn't see her. She was way at the end of the line, and she stood and she waited to get her book signed. And if I'd seen her, I would have, brought her up sooner. But she said, I had to wait because I had to tell you what it was like in our small town in Missouri when that movie came through in late 1939. She said, we all knew about it, and we all knew it was color. She said, of course, then it started and it wasn't in color, but nobody cared because you got so involved with the characters and the story. And she said, and then Judy Garland sang that song. I don't think I need to tell you what song that song was, and worried about the dog and running away from home and the tornado, which was common to Missouri. She said everybody was so wrapped up in all of this. And then when we least expected it, Judy goes and opens the door, and it becomes color. She said there was a gasp in our little movie theater. And she said the whole audience, she said, which was several hundred people, the whole audience stood up and started to applaud. They were so excited.
That says it all. I mean, I can only imagine what the reaction would have been and how absolutely revolutionary. Just seeing a color movie, maybe for the first time among a lot of these audiences, but just that transition is just so brilliant.
Yes, absolutely. Right. The sheer surprise of it, and then the beauty of it.
Yep, absolutely. So Exhibit C to the jury. The Wicked Witch of the West, to me, remains a young child's gateway to so many things, including horror cinema. So alongside the evil queen or witch in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, this antagonist can be utterly terrifying in look and words, actions, and intentions to wee ones, right? 80 years later, the witch, to me, has lost none of her power to conjure up frightened kids. You still see little kids watching this movie, and I have, kids in my family, nieces, nephews, and so forth, who will watch this, and that witch still terrifies. She's a major reason to me why this film works so powerfully as myth and fantasy.
Well, absolutely. Again, one thing that makes the story work, any good story work, is conflict, and the witch provides the conflict. Now, in Frank Baum's book, the Wicked Witch of the West is a one-chapter character after they've been to the Emerald City the first time. She doesn't turn up in Munchkinland, she doesn't want the shoes until she sees Dorothy wearing them when Dorothy comes to capture her or take care of her. And again, MGM was very, very wise to reconfigure the story in that manner. Plus, you mentioned the evil queen who becomes the crone. The year before Wizard of Oz, year and a half, 2 years, that was terrifying to kids. But
it still is.
But the Wizard of Oz, it's not a cartoon. That is a real person. And unless you prepare kids and say it's a real person who's dressed up like we dress up on Halloween. It's bad enough that the black and white lady tried to take the dog, but now this threatening one is just hovering, and they plant her very intelligently in Munchkinland, behind the apple tree, on the roof of the Tin Man's cottage, then looking through a crystal ball of the poppy, then flying overhead. I think it's on YouTube. Somebody has done, 3 installments of all of Margaret Hamilton's scenes in The Wizard of Oz, and it comes to no more than 13 minutes, 14 minutes.
Wow.
But again, judiciously used, and the fact that she was encouraged to go all out, which she did. One of the great things that I discovered along the way, thanks to Robert Baum, who is the great-grandson of Frank Baum, and he inherited his great-grandmother Maud's, Frank's widow's, scrapbook that she put together in 1939 when the Wizard of Oz movie came out. She was still alive. She went to the premiere. But one of the many clippings in there is a review from the second sneak preview of Oz from June 1939, so 2 months before it opened around the country. And MGM took it out at least 3 times to sneak preview it at a much longer length than the movie we know. And the headline in the Pomona paper the day after the sneak preview in Pomona is "Child's Book Made into Adult's Film." And the critics said this movie is not for children, at least in the form that was exhibited here last night.
Wow.
And you can imagine MGM's panic, because, again, this was supposed to be all ages and a children's fantasy like Snow White. And one of the things, they cut 20 minutes from the rough cut of Wizard of Oz, roughly 20 minutes, to the premiere timing of 101 minutes. And what they took out as many of Margaret Hamilton's individual lines as they could.
Such a shame. I want to move on to the next question, but I had one more point about this in terms of why it matters. To me, this story just feels so timeless, right? We can agree. As any classic storybook fairy tale you'd read to your kids would. Yes, it's set in Dust Bowl, Kansas at the end of the Great Depression. To a lot of us, especially younger generations, we're not going to really have any context or understanding of that other than the history books. And yes, hardscrapple, bucolic farm life can feel like an alien world to modern viewers, young and old. But the archetypes, John, the archetypes are so universal and resonant. A child who doesn't quite fit in with her native environment, who dreams of a bigger, more fulfilling life somewhere else. A place over the rainbow that's likely unattainable but fun to fantasize about. Interestingly, this child is also parentless, as many protagonists in Disney movies are, which adds to her alienation and makes her all the more sympathetic. It's also, as we have already talked about, it's got a classic villain, Miss Gulch / the Wicked Witch, who serves as a very serious threat to Dorothy and her dog. And of course, those colorful supporting characters who join our hero on her quest. I mean, it's got everything you'd want in a classic fairy tale kind of story.
It's got everything you'd want in life if you are a misfit. Every kid can identify with that feeling of being divorced or estranged from surroundings. I think that's one of the things that makes the movie work, is that every kid can identify with Dorothy's care for her pet and the idea that the pet is going to be taken away. And every kid can identify with the idea of sometimes not feeling happy at home, whatever kind of home they have, and wanting to run away, thinking about running away.
Good point.
And then every kid can think about, oh, I'm lost. How do I get home? What a terrifying thing that is for every kid. That's the first 12 minutes, 15 minutes of the movie, before you even get to Technicolor. So you are totally involved. From there, the story continues as a journey, which there isn't a soul of us who isn't on a journey. Baum was great with that book. The fact that the Scarecrow in the book and in the movie is always the one who thinks of things to get them out of trouble, even though he doesn't have a brain. The Tin Man is the emotional, sentimental one. The Lion is the one who is scared but jumps right in to defend Dorothy when he has to. We all have these qualities that we think we need. What we have to do is call upon them. Again, none of this is terribly original, but on the 80th anniversary, I think it's important, as you started to, and as I've tried to continue, to emphasize some of them.
No question about it. Let's transition into influence and inspiration from The Wizard of Oz. So how was this movie influential on cinema and popular culture, or set trends in any way?
It was either last year or earlier this year that a team of Italian researchers, scientists, whatever, many fields, reviewed 47,000 films and found out that the number one film that influenced more films than any other was The Wizard of Oz, influencing in terms of so many of the things we've mentioned, scripting, cinematography, black and white to color, quoted lines, format reproductions, templates that follow the Wizard of Oz template in another way. I think E.T. is the most extraordinary example of the Wizard of Oz in mirror image. Yes,
yeah, you explained this on the Blu-ray. I remember watching it. It was a great theory, which I totally love.
E.T. is the stranger who's helped by three normal people, whereas Dorothy is the normal person who's helped by three, for lack of a better adjective, strange people. And they help her get home. Elliot and his brother and sister help E.T. get home. There is the heartrending farewell scene before E.T. leaves. And if this hasn't all resonated with you by now, E.T.'s spaceship leaves a rainbow arc across the sky to kind of hammer it further home. God bless Spielberg, and then in other ways George Lucas, and the people who did fall in love with this stuff and wanted to be storytellers, wanted to be myth makers, and took the risks.
I looked this up, and I'm sure there are other examples you can even cite, but the Coen brothers, David Lynch, Martin Scorsese, John Borman, Michael Powell, and Emmerich Pressburger. So many filmmakers have cited this as a major influence, and even in subtle ways in their works that they try to pay homage to it.
Absolutely. I mean, how many times in a film or in a sitcom or a TV drama or in a newscast or in a newspaper headline or a sermonette have you heard paraphrases of, I have a feeling we're not in, Oak Park anymore or Oak Lawn anymore or in Milwaukee anymore, or pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. All the editorial cartoons, Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, so much of that comes rushing home. We talked about movie musicals. I think one thing that is important to note, too, and I concur with your estimation about Oz as a classic screen musical, we always hear that Showboat on the Broadway stage in the late 1920s was the first majorly integrated musical where the songs helped carry the plot forward and advance the characterization.
Jerome Kern, if I'm not mistaken, right?
And Oscar Hammerstein, right, and P.G. Wodehouse. Well, then Oz comes along a dozen years later and carries that to a greater extreme, and then 4 years after Oz, we have Rodgers and Hammerstein in Oklahoma, which kicked the whole thing into gear. But Oz was seminal in that kind of approach to telling a story in song and dance, and influenced countless movies that came later.
And then you think about how many sequels and prequels and remakes and spin-offs this film gave rise to. Everything from The Wiz to Wicked and Emerald City to Oz the Great and Powerful.
And Tin Man and Return to Oz, and none of it, for all the fact that Wicked as a stage musical and Oz the Great and Powerful have made zillions of dollars, nothing manages to supplant, but not so far anyway, the MGM film. It is the immediate touchstone for everybody, and that's the Oz they know. They may come to enjoy Wicked and Oz the Great and Powerful, but the MGM movie has permeated so many lives by dint of it being, first of all, that once-a-year special day for kids who grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then by the end of the 80s, when it was so available on home video, you could record it, there were kids watching it 4 times a day. There are kids of 10 who have seen it now more times than I have because they did watch it that much. But again, it just resonates, and it gets to them at a young age, and they get involved, and they never forget it, and they introduce their kids to it.
Let me ask you about the color, the Technicolor, as well as the special effects, which we've already gone into some detail about. How would those elements have been influential, inspirational on filmmakers to follow?
Well, I think, again, it is more, I think, is one of the reasons that Oz has endured is that people now are aware of the fact, if they're adults or if they know anything about film history, that they are seeing everything cut out of whole cloth when they watch that movie, that there was no CGI. And I think it influenced MGM and to keep putting money into big productions. I think it influenced the other studios in having to keep up with what MGM was doing. I think the fact that they made creatures fly and a Wicked Witch fly and found ways to do fire and smoke effects, injuring people in the process, but they found ways to do it. This just expands. Again, the more those people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and the people that they trained who worked in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and who trained the people who are working now, high water marks. like this has to be at least as good as The Tornado and The Wizard of Oz.
How about immediately following 1939? I mean, would a movie like The Thief of Baghdad, for example, have taken a major cue from The Wizard of Oz? Would Disney films in any way have been inspired? I'm just curious if you've traced that at all.
I think that the Disney films, again, Snow White I should have referenced as a point between show in Oklahoma as well, because the songs very much carry it forward there. It's different, though, when it's done by human beings. And Disney didn't do any really live-action musical films until, I believe, Babes in Toyland in 1960-61, and then Mary Poppins right after that. But they certainly had learned how to do it. One of the reasons Disney didn't follow through in 1957 with the Technicolor feature Rainbow Road to Oz starring the Musketeers is that he realized that they could not come up with a score or a script that was going to compete with the MGM film. And if Disney didn't think they could, again, but they set their sights on it. They did Babes in Toyland, as I said, 3 years later, and then Mary Poppins really proved that Disney could make that kind of film.
So just think about what you're saying. It's like these other major studios, and Disney is no small player here. They realize you can't top this movie. How do you come up with an encore to The Wizard of Oz? How do you possibly try to top it?
Well, 20th Century Fox did the very next year by starring Shirley Temple in The Bluebird, which is one of the most difficult pictures to sit through to this day. It has some charming effects, but again, the dream, the sepia beginning, the Technicolor fantasy, the people in her real world turning up in her fantasy world.
But here's the thing, John. Nobody talks about that movie or even remembers it.
No, exactly, because it's not entertaining. And I know that's a very simplistic point of view, but Oz engages you because it engages your emotions. You mentioned Singing in the Rain, which, again, as a musical comedy, nothing really can touch it. But Singing in the Rain, there's not much heart to Singing in the Rain.
How can you top the music in The Wizard of Oz?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, too, because The Wizard of Oz is an hour and 41 minutes long. After the first hour and 5 minutes, there is no more music. Right. After If I Were King of the Forest, there is no other song. The Jitterbug was cut, the Over the Rainbow reprise in the Witch's Castle was cut, and the triumphal return to the Emerald City with the Witch's Broomstick was cut. That's the 1 minute I would wish had survived. You see after Dorothy melts the witch and the Winky Guards are chanting, "The Wicked Witch is dead," and the film dissolves to the head of the great owl saying, "Can I believe my eyes? Why have you come back?" Well, watch that segue. Watch the dissolve, because after the guards say, "The Wicked Witch is dead," their mouths keep moving as the film goes through, but you don't hear anything. And what they kept doing was singing, they went into the song, "Hail, hail, the witch is dead, witch, old witch, the wicked witch."
Okay.
And then they did 8 bars, and it dissolved to a huge procession through the Emerald City streets, 300-some green-clad extras escorting Dorothy and company, the Scarecrow carrying the Wicked Witch's broomstick, through the streets of the Emerald City back to the Palace of the Wizard.
Wow.
And it's
amazing.
A great vocal arrangement, great orchestration, but no film. Just
so
still
why did they cut
track.
Some of these numbers? Besides, we talked about the Jitterbug, but like what you just described, was it...
just to tighten the film.
Yeah.
You know, a big film, 90, 95 minutes. Wizard of Oz at 101 was, kind of pushing it.
I see.
But, and I think that's the main reason. And Ray Bolger had the one film clip that does survive. Ray Bolger went back when the principal photography was just about done, and he and Judy redid the whole If I Only Had a Brain sequence with a big extended dance. That does survive and is on all the DVDs.
But your major point here, comparing it to, for example, Singing in the Rain, you were saying after a certain point there is no more music. Were you getting to a larger point?
Well, just again, we Wizard of Oz is a musical, and you have stated that you think it's the most effective movie musical, or the best, and how ironic that we feel that way when more than the last third of the film has no songs whatsoever.
I see. Yeah, it's a good point. Do you agree with me? Is it your favorite musical?
Oh, I guess I don't even think of The Wizard of Oz as a film anymore. The Wizard of Oz is some rarefied pop culture phenomenon.
It's a way of life, right?
Yeah, exactly. As early as I guess it was 65 or 66, Time Magazine, for the annual showing, did a full-page article called The Oz Bowl Game, talking about how this Sunday is the hallowed event on the childhood calendar, and the children know the performers as well as their fathers know the major professional football players. This is the Oz Bowl Game, and how after those first 5 or 6 national telecasts, it had become the annual event. We always say the December holidays, Christmas and Hanukkah, your birthday, and the night The Wizard of Oz was on. If you were a kid, I've had so many people talk to me about their memories of those years. Oh, we got to stay up late. Oh, we put our pajamas on right after dinner. Oh, we got to eat in the den. Or we had popcorn and orange soda.
I remember when they'd cut to commercial break.
I understand. And the most poignant of all the recollections I've heard about families watching The Wizard of Oz, somebody told me a few years ago that the film means so much to them now, 30, 40 years later, 50 years later. He said, that's the only time I can remember our family not fighting, not quarreling, when there wasn't negative tension in the house. He said, for those 2 hours, all of us sat and watched that movie.
Fascinating. Yeah, absolutely.
That's power.
What messages or themes are examined in The Wizard of Oz? So what's the moral to the story here? Now, the obvious one is there's no place like home. Let's get into that. What does that mean to you, and how do you kind of parse through that?
Well, I think one of the bum raps the picture has gotten over the years from some people is, no place like home. Why do you want to go home? Maybe their home isn't very happy. Or maybe they're looking at it from an adult perspective. But from Dorothy's perspective, that was the home to which she wanted to return because that was her home. That's what she knew. And Ray Bolger, when he guested on Judy's TV series in the 60s, talked about the Oz books and how, and this wraps it all up in a couple sentences, he said his mother taught him, these books, they're great philosophy, that everybody has a brain, everybody has a heart, and everybody has courage, that these are the gifts that God gives to people on earth. And it's up to us to use them. And if you use them properly, they lead you home. But home isn't a house or an abode. Home is people, the people you love and the people who love you. And I think that is what we seek all of our lives. As a child, it's parental figures or brothers and sisters or both. When you're a little older, it's like you're seeking a life partner or extended family among your friends. These are the people to whom you'd want to return. If you were suddenly taken far from home, you would want to be back with your family, obviously. So there is that truth that there is no place like home if you define home as the people you love and the people who love you.
Now, it's interesting because this quote has several meanings to me, and I agree with everything you said. But I think to me, it's, okay, first, and this is up for debate. I mean, it's obviously a subjective thing, but to me, it speaks to you should never take your family or your community or your roots for granted, nor forget about where you came from. On one hand, John, this sounds like a pretty conservative message that would discourage like adventure or wanderlust or discovery beyond the safe and familiar. But I think this quote is also saying that your happiness shouldn't depend on external forces, that you can and should look to find joy and fulfillment inside, not outside yourself. And just because you may live in a less than desirable milieu, it doesn't mean you can't find happiness, especially in the simple pleasures of life, like friendship and doing things for others.
Well, I think it's true, but again, you do move on. If you have the goals or the ambitions or the desires, you do move on, and you do find the people with whom you have things in common, who are not family members. I think, too, the idea of there's no place like home is the home inside yourself, the learning to be comfortable in your own skin, the learning to be grateful for what you have, to try to improve yourself where you think you can, but to just make the most of the gifts you've been given.
I think there's a part two to this to me, the value of self-discovery and self-reliance. And the message to me anyway is pretty clear. The secrets of fulfillment can be found within. And this is echoed in what Glinda says of Dorothy. She says, you've always had the power to go back to Kansas. You had to learn it for yourself. So it turns out that the great and powerful Oz was a sham, right? He didn't have the magic to send Dorothy home despite her hopes and faith in him. Dorothy needed to solve the problem herself.
I think it's absolutely true. And I think you always find, again, in the Oz books, you find Dorothy being an extraordinarily resourceful little girl, a little girl who is afraid of many of the challenges and wonders and worries through the Oz books, the first 5 in which she appears, and still always wants to go back to Uncle Henry and Auntie Em. And then by the 6th book, she brings them to Oz to live with her, and Toto too, and that takes care of that. But again, then Oz becomes this much greater extended family of her friends in Oz, and that becomes her world because she has had the drive to get up and get out and explore. And you don't ever have to leave your hometown to do that. Mm-hmm. You can give all of your heart and soul and gifts to locally and have a wonderfully fulfilled life.
Right.
You can also pick up and leave.
Mm-hmm. I think it also speaks to the movie. It speaks to the importance of friendship and unity, how achieving a goal often requires help from others. Dorothy likely wouldn't have gotten very far on her journey without the aid of her companions. I think we can agree, right?
Nor would they have gotten very far without her aid.
And they even say as much. I wouldn't have gotten very far without her.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So whether all of this resonates with young adults after they've grown up on The Wizard of Oz or not, who knows what subliminally is occurring.
I was going to say, as I get older, it becomes more problematic to me, the whole, dangers of trusting in a false idol kind of theme to me, the man behind the curtain. The people of Emerald City, they practically worship the Wizard of Oz, and Dorothy and her friends put all their hopes in his ability to solve their problems. But of course, they learn that the Wiz is really a crafty old man who bluffs his way to greatness, and yet the man behind the curtain is able to help bring out the best in each of our heroes, so you feel better about him. Anyway, I do. What do you feel about this in terms of a theme or a sub-theme in the film? I mean, am I making too much of this?
Not too much, but I think you have to avoid layering too much responsibility or too much duty on the film when, again, it was designed as entertainment. Right. I think, again, it resonates because there are all these points that can be ascribed to it because it is so familiar, it is so involving, it is so engaging. And again, as you pointed out, even the wizard is kind of like a therapist in the end, because he says, you have these things, you are just looking for something to kind of remind you. Again, you can't go too deep with this stuff because they were not doing a treatise when they made this film, but the basic truths are maybe surface truths, but as such, they can go in a million different directions as we just have.
Although I got to tell you, I don't want to belabor this point. I know we want to move on here, but I can't remember. I'm sure you know it by heart. I got to tell you, it stopped me dead in my tracks this time. What does Dorothy say to Glinda when she says, what have you learned? She says, well, I learned this and this and this. But then she says something that's kind of cryptic to me.
I think that it wasn't enough just to want to see Uncle Henry and Auntie Em.
Yes.
It said, if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard.
That's clear.
Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with.
Now that part, I got to tell you, it stopped me this time. I always just took it for granted. I had to ask myself, what is she really meaning there?
I think it's something that can be overanalyzed. I think they purposely kept it kind of generic.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it's that kind of realization that your own backyard is not only Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, that your own backyard is not just your family, it is yourself. It is the self-awareness and the looking inside. Again, the reminding yourself to look inside, because if it isn't there, then you haven't lost it. It is there. You have to just keep doing that investigation and continuing along. Yeah. And I think that has a lot to do with it. But again, it's very simplistic in the film, and I understand the confusion because it confused me for a long time too. And then I realized, John, just go with it.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you, this time around, another moral stood out that never stood out before because of its timeliness. Let's put it this way. Here it is. You ready? The dangers of opioid addiction. We see our merry band nearly OD on poppies, right?
You're pressing, Eric. You're pressing.
I'm looking for too much in one of my favorite movies.
But then the realists will tell you, and did you know that the snow was made of asbestos? As if there was a big plot there, too. And it's like, guys, I'm sorry. Nobody knew. just move on. They didn't ask them to sleep in it for 3 weeks,
Right.
24 hours a day. And then the Pythagorean theorem, isn't that what it is? The scarecrow spouts when he gets his diploma.
Supposedly
That
it's
is
not correct
inaccurate.
what he says. Yeah.
That is inaccurate. And I've always thought that was just Noah Langley, who oversaw most of the Oz scripting and is responsible for a lot of it, had a wicked sense of humor. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if that wasn't intentional on his part or on everybody's part. The idea being that anybody who can speak with authority can, like this John Fricke person, this Oz historian, you think, oh, he knows this all. Well, who knows what he's making up? But if you say it with conviction, it's got to be true.
Well, in 1939, you couldn't look up the Pythagorean theorem on the internet, right? So
You certainly couldn't, or asbestos.
Exactly. John, you're the perfect person to ask this question of. Who did this movie appeal to initially when it debuted in 1939? Remember what you said. You said even some reviews and critics said this is not a movie for kids. So I'm curious, I mean, was it a no-brainer? The parents took their kids. So who did it appeal to on its original release? And who do you think The Wizard of Oz appeals to today?
I think that the appeal earlier on was a cross-generational appeal. I thought that, anybody who is interested in going to the movies would enjoy it, especially people who liked music. And The Wizard of Oz did very, very, very well in big cities. It didn't always do well in small towns. It was a little, off the beaten track in terms of film entertainment. People were maybe not ready for fantasy played by living actors.
But do you know for a fact, I mean, did a large contingent of the audience consist of children?
Oh, definitely. In fact, that's one reason that The Wizard of Oz broke attendance records all over the place in 1939. And it made good money, but it did not break even because, say, 2/3, maybe even in some cases 3/4 of the seats were being filled by kids who paid 10 or 15 or 20 cents to get into the theater, as opposed to adults who paid 25, 35, 45, or 50 cents.
Interesting, yeah.
And again, teenagers, I think, were more inclined to go to a film like that because movie making or movie going was so integral to the life of a teenager in the late 30s and into the early 40s. That's why Judy and Mickey Rooney and Deanna Durbin became such huge stars because the teen audiences loved seeing people their own age.
Yeah, wasn't Mickey Rooney the biggest box office draw at this time or something like that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
38, 39, and 40, I believe. And Judy was in the top 10 in 40 and 41. Deanna had been. And so, again, there was that sense of, wow, look what they're doing. Because the kids who had grown up with Shirley Temple had kind of grown past Shirley Temple. Shirley was, 10, 11, still not being asked to do the same kind of vehicle she'd done, whereas the kids, were like 12, 13, 14, 15, and they wanted to see kids achieving, which Garland and Rooney did to the nth degree. No, I think that there was a great box office appeal to all ages, when the film first came out. I think now, by contrast, you've got to get the kids young enough before, in this day and age, they get too sophisticated with other kinds of entertainment and other kinds of music.
So what do you think is the ideal age to introduce them to The Wizard of Oz?
I think maybe 4.
Okay.
If they're the kids that will understand, you can explain about the witch being a Halloween character and the monkeys are men in costumes and that kind of thing. If you've got overly sensitive kids, or normally sensitive kids probably. But then again, by the time they get to be 10, 11, they're poo-pooing whatever they liked as a kid.
Right.
They all come back to it, though.
Sure.
I have found this. The first time I saw Wizard of Oz in color was when I was a freshman in college. We did not have a color set at home. And I kept wondering how, in January or February 1970, was I going to commandeer the color TV in the one TV lounge in the 3-floor all-male dormitory at Northwestern so that I could watch The Wizard of Oz and see it in color the first time. Well, I needn't have worried because there were more guys watching Wizard of Oz than had been in to watch the Super Bowl.
Is that right?
Because it had 15 years of it being an event and something they shared. And as long as you don't worry about liking something that may be perceived as uncool, you can like it at any point, at any age.
But it's interesting, you bring up, there's different age aspects of this movie where, of course, it's going to appeal to younger kids, especially if their parents or grandparents introduce them to it and so forth. But then there's kind of a falling out, a too cool for school period where a lot of kids, like you say, teenagers maybe and so forth in this era, who will kind of, profess to not like it or it's beneath
Well,
me.
they don't like any movie like that. They don't like musicals. They don't like black and white. And,
right.
And it's unfortunately that attitude has pretty much developed, I think, since the 1960s.
Yeah.
The whole cool thing has permeated, and it's a big bloody bore.
Absolutely. And I want to get into this more with you on one of the last questions. But the good news is that too cool for school kind of attitude, it washes away after a certain point as you get older, and especially if you have kids of your own, right? Isn't it kind of a rite of passage? If you're an adult, if you're a parent rather, you kind of have a responsibility to introduce your kids to this movie at some point, right?
Well, I think if you're a good parent, you have the responsibility to introduce your kids to a lot of things. Right. And that is a challenge that, unfortunately, many parents, whether coupled or single parents, can't meet in the times through which we're living and have been living. It is ever more of a challenge, but it is worth it because, again, no harm can come from watching Wizard of Oz. It elevates and it enthralls and it introduces them to a kind of music that is very important to know.
Well said. Absolutely. So are there any aspects of The Wizard of Oz, John, that haven't held up so well 80 years later? Anything stand out that is either problematic or, well, it's really showing some wrinkles all these years later?
I think, again, if one wants to analyze, especially as the restorations get clearer and clearer and clearer in 4K, with the 4K Blu-ray just came out a month ago.
That's right.
For the first time. There's just this sense of, well, that's a painted backdrop, or that's not a very frightening bird in the haunted forest.
Have you actually seen the 4K edition?
No, I haven't yet.
Okay, I'm curious if you see more wires or harnesses or things like that.
Well, I think they're very careful. Again, I don't know if they painted them out. I'd have to talk to my friends at Warner Brothers about what approach they have taken. Again, you can see Judy Garland's freckles through the makeup. I think the thing is, for the kids, they're so involved with the story, they don't even notice that this is real. In fact, it looks real because it was real at the time. Mm-hmm. That is a witch disappearing in flame and smoke. That is a witch sinking through the ground as if she were melting. Those are flying monkeys that you see. And it's like, whoa, and for the adults who see it, or the more cynical young adults who might see it, you get so swept up in it. And then you stop and think, my gosh, they did all of this for real. They didn't have computers. They had to create this. Look at how well they did this. Look at how well they did the makeup. Look at how well the actors perform while carrying around, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 pounds of costuming. Mm-hmm. And again, there's a wonderful, of its time, but still not dated facility of The Wizard of Oz. I mean, the average person who doesn't know anything about it would think, oh, this movie is older, but no more than 20 years, 15 years, 25 years. You tell them 80 years, and they fall over. So I think the wrinkles are in the special effects, yet you look at them, and it's like you just marvel that they were done at all.
Yeah. Absolutely,
and that they and none of them is on screen long enough for you to take out your microscope and say, "Oh well."
It just seems to me unfair to try to poke holes in a movie for its special effects. When again, at the time, it was just so groundbreaking. It just seems almost unfair to me. But for my part, in the original book by L. Frank Baum, the character of Dorothy is, I believe, supposed to be about 12 years old. I think.
No, she's younger than that. He never gives her age.
Okay.
But basically, from the pictures, Dorothy's probably about 7.
To me, it's a little far-fetched to believe that this Dorothy, played by a 16-year-old Judy Garland, is 12 or so, if that's what they're going for.
That's exactly what they were going for. I was either Newsweek or Time who referred to her as a more buxom Dorothy than appeared in the W.W. Denslow illustrations in the original book. Point taken. But Christopher Finch, who wrote one of the early Garland biographies, one of the rare, really good Garland biographies, when he discusses The Wizard of Oz, he makes the point that the film works so well because Judy Garland is a 16-year-old actress playing younger, but singing with the voice of a 30-year-old, which means that kids identified with her, teens identified with her, and adults identified with her.
You can't have, to me, Shirley Temple in this role, even though she was the first one kind of considered. Just too young, not mature enough. You got to have somebody who can really sing that song.
Oh, precisely. And, the script and the songs were written for Judy. The property was purchased for Judy Garland. The Shirley Temple legend is one of those myths that has been blown way up out of proportion. There's not much paperwork left at MGM. They threw it all out in 1970. There are certain Oz paperwork pieces that still exist, and I went to Shirley Temple's file at MGM, and it does not start until 1940 when MGM signed her to do a couple of pictures. There are no memos about Shirley Temple in the legal files for Wizard of Oz, nothing whatsoever.
Yeah, and the only other thing to me that stands out a little bit is, again, an age thing. So if we're supposed to believe that Dorothy's a preteen, it's a little hard to swallow that Auntie Em and Uncle Henry are that old, or at least look that old. Now, Charlie Grapewin was 70, I looked up, in 1939, and Clara Blandick is 63. They certainly look their ages, right?
Maybe they were Dorothy's great aunt and great uncle. You don't know. And then, but you look at Frank Morgan in all 5 of the parts he played. He was 49 years old.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's because he looks 65.
Well, some of that is good makeup, right?
Well, yes and no. You look at him in pictures where he's, playing more or less himself. When he's not, I think Professor Marvel is pretty much Frank Morgan as himself. There's no major makeup there. There may be the mustache, but no, his hair was not, dyed gray because he was such a naturally, dark-headed man still. Mm-hmm. Again, 40 was so old, 1939. 40 was old in 1965.
Yeah, that's a great point.
People weren't going to gyms. They weren't being tucked and lifted. They weren't moisturizing.
Life expectancy was a lot shorter back then, too.
Sure. Precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, Morgan died 10 years after The Wizard of Oz at 59.
Sad, yeah.
And he was a senior citizen.
Mm-hmm. Great points. So, John, we've come to the ultimate Cineversary question I ask of every guest. Now, we're celebrating The Wizard of Oz's 80th birthday, but to me, it's the fans who are the ones who continue to get the birthday gifts. So what is this film's greatest gift to viewers?
I think you sum it up by wrapping up in a package all the points we've discussed. The philosophical lessons, the gentle morals, the type of entertainment it presents that is not being done any longer because people don't know how, the technological splendor of it, the great original story, the fact that you can see every penny of the $3.7 billion on the screen, the fact that all of these actors were so supreme at what they did and were encouraged to do what they did. Let Lahr camp it up. Let Bolger keep toppling down on the yellow brick road. Let Haley be breathless and sincere. Let Hamilton be scary. Let Billy Burke be ditzy. There's room for all of that, and it's showcased brilliantly. This is why it's the gift that keeps on giving, because all of that stuff resonates. And in 101 minutes, it never stops intriguing you or entrancing you or holding your attention, because it moves very quickly and very swiftly, yet it still hits like the greatest Steinway or Baldwin of all time. You hit those notes, and they are pure emotion. Funny emotion, sad emotion, poignant emotion, exciting emotion. It is a straight appeal to the heart.
So well put.
Somebody should sing Battle Hymn of the Republic, because I've never said that before.
Wow, I got a great new quote from John Fricke that he's never given to anybody else. I'm a lucky guy.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Trust me, I feel very lucky. But to me, John, the number one greatest single attribute of the movie, again, personal choice, it's the music. The songs are woven into the American fabric. They're so ingrained in our cultural history as to be part of the shared soundtrack of collective childhoods. Now, I get it. Kids may not play this on a record player anymore like they did when I was a kid. I remember a friend of mine actually had the record, and I'm growing up in the 70s, so this is not, the 40s or 50s. But today, yeah, okay, they may not have it on their playlists or whatever, but the songs, these lyrics by heart. That showstopper medley in Munchkinland, to me, is just the tour de force here. The lyrics and melodies of which form such a rich musical tapestry of joy and wonder. And again, you brought up earlier, there actually aren't as many songs in this movie as you would think, perhaps, compared to other classic Hollywood musicals, but they're just so unforgettable. But to directly answer this question, what is The Wizard of Oz's greatest gift? I think it's pretty simple. It's the ability to make each of us feel like a kid again. Most of us were introduced to this classic at a young age. We've already talked about this. And many of us can still remember the impression it had on us as a child. It's a film that parents and grandparents pass on to the younger generations as a kind of rite of passage. And part of the pleasure of watching it again as an adult is to observe the effect it can have on young ones viewing it with you, to see how their eyes light up as the characters and settings are introduced and how the action unfolds. And that's my recommendation, folks, listening to this podcast. Watch the movie with kids and appreciate the amazing impact this 80-year-old masterwork can have on new fans screening it for the first or second or third time. It really enriches the experience. When you watch it with a child with you and you just see the wonder in their eyes, it can really bring a tear to your eye how effective that is.
Now I'll sing Battle Hymn of the Republic. No, I think all of that is true. And again, it was made... The story by Baum was meant to entertain. Mm-hmm. MGM, as the biggest studio in Hollywood at the time, was in the entertainment business. The picture and the songs were built around that supreme entertainer, that little girl who threw to everybody during her life, even across cold media like film and videotape and vinyl and cassette, and who to this day remains a working experience. It's almost impossible to remain emotionally uninvolved if you're watching something that Judy Garland is doing, because she was so real. There was no artifice, and again, she pulls you in. So it is across the boards just this great coalescence. Is it an auteur movie? No, unless the auteur is the MGM Studios, which indeed it was. And the biggest and the best that turned out the biggest and the best motion picture. People can argue that, and everybody has his or her favorites. I understand that. But again, to engage kids wonderingly, excitedly, something that amazes them and stirs their emotions, pro and con, but again, teaches them good stuff. You don't have to worry about the language. You don't have to worry about any innuendo. You just take it as the great American story as told by the great American film studio.
No question. So, John, do you believe The Wizard of Oz will still be regarded as relevant and as widely watched, for that matter, in another 80 years? What's going to happen in 2100?
Well, I'll still be watching it. I would hate to think of a world where The Wizard of Oz would still not be effective. It would be a very, very, very sad commentary on tastes and mores and emotions if that film didn't still resonate. I'm very proud of the fact that it has risen above all the changing tastes in entertainment, that it has risen above all the good and bad and mediocre attempts to echo it or sequel it or prequel it. I am so very, very grateful to have been chosen to be a Wizard of Oz and Judy Garland fan.
Wow.
One of your earlier questions, why is the movie important to me? Mm-hmm. The first time somebody asked me that was in 2005 at the Deauville Film Festival in France. They debuted the first restoration version there from the original negative. And the guy who did the technical work and I were taken to France to launch this. And there was a multi-language press conference with 25 journalists and a translator, and then the next day about 15 individual interviews that each of us did. And at the end of a long day, some of the questions were the same questions over and over, but every once in a while you got a new one, as I did with you tonight. But a journalist said to me, "What does this film mean to you now?" Mm-hmm. And as a writer, I have so often gratefully said, sometimes God sends the words. And he asked me, "What does this film mean to you now?" And I opened my mouth and I heard myself say, by now this film has become a passport to my entire life.
Wow. Because
there's been no juncture at my life that Oz or Judy Garland or all the offshoots that I have traversed, the paths that Judy and Oz have led me to travel, there's not a day that isn't involved with that somehow. Where I've been very blessed is that I have been given the opportunity to do the projects and do the work and have them well received and have them lead to other things. Yeah. And this was never supposed to become a career, ever. But starting in the late 1980s and for more than 30 years, this has been it.
Well, what's the best advice everybody gives you? Do what you love, and it sounds like that's certainly true of your chosen profession, right?
Yeah, the only ones who haven't said that to me are my creditors, but you can edit that out if you would.
It's time to write a new Oz book, right?
Oh, another one. And I'm so grateful that when people want to talk about it, they will sometimes come to me and ask the questions, and it's fun to share this stuff. Because no matter how many times they've seen it, there are things that they have missed or that they want to go back and check out again, and that kind of stuff. And people giving you trivia questions like, all right, when you see the Wizard's balloon in the Emerald City, it says Omaha State Fair. What does it say on the other side? Like they're trying to catch you in something. There was no other side. It was a flat painted thing. There was no balloon.
Sure, they tried to stump the master.
Well, I did. I had one darling little boy, and he cornered me. I was speaking to a middle school somewhere, and the teacher gave me a far too flowery an introduction about how I know everything about the Wizard of Oz movie, everything about the Wizard of Oz movie, everything about the Wizard of Oz movie. Do you have any questions for Mr. Fricke? And this one hand shot up, a kid of about 10, 11 maybe, and he said, yeah, how many bricks were in the yellow brick road?
Did you venture an answer, or what did you do?
I cheated. I looked him right in the eye and said, there were exactly 13,422 and a half
Did he believe you?
On the yellow brick road. Well, it shut him up. I don't know if he believed me. I didn't see him taking notes.
Oh, that's priceless. John, it's got to be almost like being like Bruce Lee. People would come up to him and challenge him to a fight because it's Bruce Lee, you know. I'm sure there's times where people will come up to you and try to challenge you on a, like you said, a trivia question or something. I'm going to stump John here, you know, right?
Oh, yeah, I get that. There's some very good information out there, but in terms of a lot of the rest of it, all I can do is quote the Scarecrow, who says, some people without brains do an awful lot of talking. I could spend the rest of my life going around and even gently, politely correcting, and some of them still wouldn't buy it. And it's fun. It's Oz. If it's not fun, we're doing it wrong.
Right.
To give you the title of another film and inject one adjective, it's a wonderful Ozzy life.
Love it. Before we conclude here, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out?
I will be doing the 4 major festivals again this year, one in upstate New York in Frank Baum's hometown, one in Judy Garland's hometown in Minnesota, at the Oz Museum in Wamego, Kansas, the suburban Chicago Midwest Oz Festival, maybe some others. There are a couple major Oz projects in the offing, but we haven't gone to contract yet, so I can't really talk about those. But there is certainly going to be ongoing Oz and Judy Garland interest.
Now, is there a repository, a website where you have all this information and details and dates where people can check out the
I announced it. I'm just on Facebook as John Fricke, and on Instagram as John Fricke. And I'm also, next year, as things look, we'll be putting out my very first non-Oz, non-Judy book, a deluxe coffee table pictorial with a lot of text about the making of the movie White Christmas.
Fantastic.
I think it is far and away the favorite Christmas movie musical, and I'm very proud to be working on that.
Fantastic. Some good things to look forward to. John, anything further you wanted to add before we conclude?
To anyone who's listening, I thank you for sharing in all this. I hope it's been educational without being painful, and I certainly hope it's been entertaining, because you got to share this stuff, and Oz is something we have all shared all of our lives. That's one of the things that has made Oz eternal, is that it is something that is so vehemently and happily shared.
It was such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Eric.
Wow, my deepest appreciation to John Fricke for a really fun interview. There were some amazing recollections and anecdotes there from the most knowledgeable and passionate Oz fan I can say I've ever met. Now we head into standing ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. So for December, I thought long and hard about this one, and the answer became obvious. My standing ovation is a 75th anniversary celebration of another classic MGM musical, also starring Judy Garland, of course, Meet Me in St. Louis, which will be shown on the Turner Classic Movies channel on Christmas Eve at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This timeless film came back to select movie theaters for 2 dates this month, but if you missed your chance to watch it on the big screen, you can still catch it on TCM on December 24th as a nightcapper. Featuring one of the most beloved songbooks from a classic musical, including the Trolley Song and Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, Meet Me in St. Louis is a gift that keeps on giving and an often forgotten Christmas-themed movie, at least in one of its key segments. So be sure to tune in for that. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Cineversary, which wraps up another year of feeding fine films marking a major birthday. If you enjoy our program, why not leave me a positive review on whatever platform you get this podcast from? Now, that really helps our show get discovered by new listeners and grows our audience. Also, instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. And we could really use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting, provider fees, and other things. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to this podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. All you got to do is simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. We really appreciate your generosity. Eager to nominate a future movie due to celebrate an anniversary that we should feature on an upcoming episode? Want to offer some suggestions or comments? You can reach me, Eric Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com. I also encourage you to check out cineversegroup.com. That's our portal for the Cineverse Film Discussion Group I launched 14 years ago and which continues to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. We're a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At cineversegroup.com, and that's spelled Cineverse, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the films we study. Okay, if you're still here, you're probably eager to learn what's next on the docket for Cineversary. So in January, we're going to journey back to the Great Depression-era Dust Bowl to take a road trip with the Jode family as we honor another 80th anniversary, this time for The Grapes of Wrath, which made its theatrical debut in 1940. You won't want to miss that one. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies because, once again, they're not getting older, folks. They're just getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen, and happy holidays.